In a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, life for the Carrington family flowed in its usual course. Richard Carrington, a 45-year-old successful architect, had been raising his 19-year-old daughter Emily alone since his wife's death 5 years ago. Their life seemed exemplary: a loving father, a diligent daughter, a cozy home. However, behind this facade lurked a web of lies, passion, and betrayal that ultimately led to a tragedy that would shake the entire neighborhood. The appearance of Jason Nunez, a 19-year-old student at the local college and Emily's new boyfriend, became the catalyst for events that no one could have foreseen. The young man quickly charmed not only the daughter but also the father, becoming a frequent guest in their home. No one suspected that soon a forbidden passion would ignite between Richard and Jason, leading to irreversible consequences. This story of love, betrayal, and murder reveals the dark side of human nature, posing questions about the boundaries of morality and the price we are willing to pay for our desires. How did an ordinary family end up at the epicenter of such a tragedy? What led to the fatal finale? And could this chain of events have been prevented? Richard Carrington had always been considered an exemplary father and a respected member of society. After the death of his wife Laura from cancer 5 years ago, he had devoted himself entirely to raising his daughter Emily. A successful architect, he provided a comfortable life for both of them in a spacious house on Maple Street. Emily grew up to be a smart and ambitious girl. She was a freshman at the local university, studying psychology, and dreamed of becoming a child therapist. The relationship between father and daughter had always been warm and trusting. They often spent evenings together, discussing the day over dinner or watching favorite movies. Neighbors and friends admired how Richard handled the role of a single father. He not only successfully ran his architectural business but also found time to participate in his daughter's life, attending her performances in the school choir, helping with homework, organizing family hikes on weekends. However, behind this perfect facade, there were hidden problems. Richard felt a growing loneliness, which he carefully concealed from those around him. The loss of his wife had left a void in his life that he couldn't fill, despite all his efforts. He tried dating women, but no relationship worked out. Richard always found reasons to break up. Emily, in turn, also experienced difficulties. She loved her father, but sometimes felt that he was overprotective. The girl dreamed of greater independence, but was afraid of upsetting Richard, who seemed to live only for her. The life of the Carrington family was full of things left unsaid and suppressed emotions. Richard and Emily, trying to support each other, unwittingly created an atmosphere in which much remained unspoken. This situation created fertile ground for future events that would forever change their lives. The Carringtons' life changed on one autumn day when Emily first brought home her new boyfriend, Jason Nunez. Jason, a 19-year-old art student, immediately impressed Richard with his charisma and intellect. Jason grew up in a poor family of immigrants from Argentina. His parents, owners of a small Mexican restaurant, had invested all their efforts in their son's education. A talented artist, Jason had received a scholarship to the local university, where he met Emily at one of the interfaculty events. From his first appearance in a Carrington home, Jason proved to be a polite and charming young man. He showed genuine interest in Richard's work, shared his plans for the future, and dreams of becoming a famous artist. Emily beamed with happiness, seeing how well her father and boyfriend got along. Richard, initially wary of his daughter's boyfriend's appearance, quickly took a liking to Jason. He saw in the young man many qualities he valued in people: ambition, intelligence, a sense of humor. Moreover, Richard found it easy to talk with Jason about art and architecture, something he lacked in conversations with his daughter. Soon Jason became a frequent guest at the Carringtons' house. He came not only for dates with Emily but also just to chat with Richard. They could spend hours discussing modern art, sharing opinions about new exhibitions, or debating various architectural styles. Emily was initially happy about how well her father and boyfriend got along. She saw how Richard came alive in Jason's presence, becoming more energetic and less withdrawn. However, over time, the girl began to notice that her father was paying even more attention to Jason than to her. Jason, in turn, increasingly sought reasons to spend time in Richard's company. He admired the older man's experience and knowledge, finding in him not only an interesting conversationalist but also a kind of mentor. The young man felt that Richard understood his creative ambitions better than anyone else. Gradually, a special connection began to form between Richard and Jason, going beyond the usual relationship between a girl's father and her boyfriend. They both felt a growing mutual attraction, which they couldn't or didn't want to acknowledge even to themselves. This chapter in the life of the Carrington family laid the foundation for future events that none of them could have foreseen. Jason's appearance disrupted the fragile balance in the relationship between Richard and Emily, creating grounds for conflicts and misunderstandings. Weeks went by, and the relationship between Richard and Jason became increasingly close. Their meetings, initially occurring in Emily's presence, now more often happened in private. Richard began inviting Jason to his home studio, ostensibly to discuss his art projects. One evening, when Emily was in class, Richard and Jason were left alone in the studio. A discussion of contemporary art imperceptibly shifted to more personal topics. Jason shared his fears and uncertainty about the future, while Richard spoke of his loneliness after his wife's death. At some point, their eyes met, and a spark passed between them. The first kiss was unexpected for both. Richard, giving in to impulse, pulled Jason close. The young man, instead of pushing him away, returned the kiss. This moment changed everything. Both men felt a mix of guilt, fear, and uncontrollable attraction. After that night, Richard and Jason began to seek any opportunity for secret meetings. They met in Richard's studio under the pretext of working on a joint project, in cafes on the other side of town where no one knew them, in the park under the guise of morning jogs. Each meeting was filled with passion and a sense of guilt. Richard understood that his behavior was unforgivable. He was betraying his daughter's trust by entering into a relationship with her boyfriend. But his feelings for Jason were stronger than the voice of reason. For the first time in many years, he felt truly alive, desired, understood. Jason, in turn, experienced conflicting emotions. On one hand, he sincerely loved Emily and didn't want to cause her pain. On the other, he was drawn to Richard with a force he couldn't explain. Richard's maturity, experience, and understanding attracted him more than Emily's youthful love. Their secret meetings became increasingly risky. They began to lose caution, allowing themselves long glances and accidental touches even in Emily's presence. Both understood that their relationship couldn't continue forever in secret, but neither found the strength to end it. Richard tried to justify his actions by telling himself that he didn't want to destroy his daughter's happiness. He convinced himself that his relationship with Jason was a temporary lapse of judgment that would soon pass. But with each day, the feelings only intensified. Jason also sought justifications for his behavior. He told himself that he was just confused, that his attraction to Richard was merely admiration for a more experienced man. But deep down, he understood that his feelings for Emily's father were much deeper than he wanted to admit. Their secret affair had been going on for several months. Each meeting was filled with passion and fear of exposure. They understood they were playing with fire, but couldn't stop. The sense of guilt mixed with the euphoria of forbidden love, creating an explosive mixture of emotions. Meanwhile, Emily began to notice changes in her father's and boyfriend's behavior. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but her intuition told her that something was happening. The girl attributed her suspicions to paranoia, but the feeling of anxiety didn't leave her. Emily Carrington had always been observant. As a psychology student, she was accustomed to analyzing people's behavior. Therefore, the changes in the relationship between her father and boyfriend couldn't long remain unnoticed. Emily's first suspicions arose when she noticed how Richard's tone of voice changed when talking to Jason. It took on notes that she had previously heard only when her father spoke to her, a mixture of tenderness and care. At first, Emily chalked this up to her father simply becoming attached to her boyfriend. However, over time, the oddities became more numerous. Jason began to appear at their house more often, even when Emily wasn't there. He explained this as joint work on an art project with Richard, but the girl noticed how they both became nervous when she unexpectedly returned home. Emily began to pay attention to small details. How Richard and Jason exchanged glances across the table during family dinners. How they accidentally touched hands while passing each other the salt. How they fell silent when she entered the room, as if interrupting some important conversation. One day, Emily returned home earlier than usual and heard muffled voices from her father's studio. Getting closer, she distinguished Jason's voice. "We can't continue like this, Richard. It's wrong." She didn't hear her father's response, but the tone of his voice was full of emotions she had never heard before. These words made Emily think. What exactly couldn't they continue? What wrongness was Jason talking about? Her imagination painted the worst pictures, but she drove these thoughts away, considering them absurd. The girl began to secretly watch her father and Jason. She started calling home more often without warning, trying to catch them off guard. Emily even installed an app on her phone to track Jason's location, justifying it with concern for his safety. Emily's suspicions intensified when she noticed that Jason had become more distant in their relationship. His kisses became less passionate, his embraces shorter. He often seemed distracted, as if his thoughts were far away. Richard had changed too. He became less interested in his daughter's life, rarely asking about her studies and plans for the future. Instead, he increasingly brought up conversations about Jason, his talents, and prospects. Emily felt she was losing control of the situation. She loved her father and Jason, but couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something from her. The girl tried to convince herself that it was all a figment of her imagination, but her intuition screamed otherwise. One evening, when Jason once again canceled their date under the pretext of working on a project with Richard, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She decided to follow them to once and for all dispel her suspicions or confirm her worst fears. This chapter in Emily Carrington's life became a turning point. Her decision to follow her father and boyfriend led to events that forever changed the lives of all participants in this drama. The suspicions she had long tried to ignore were soon to receive terrible confirmation. On Friday evening, October 15th, Emily prepared to put her plan into action. Jason had told her he would be working late on a project with Richard in his home studio. Emily said she had a meeting with friends, but instead parked her car a few blocks from the house and waited. Around 9 in the evening, she saw Jason enter their house. Emily's heart began to race. She waited half an hour before quietly approaching the house. Light was on only in her father's studio on the second floor. Emily silently opened the front door with her key and tiptoed up the stairs. Approaching the studio door, she heard muffled voices. Emily held her breath, trying to make out the words. Suddenly she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a moan, definitely not related to work on an art project. With a trembling hand, Emily pushed the door. What she saw forever changed her life. Richard and Jason were in each other's arms, half naked, so engrossed in passion that they didn't immediately notice her presence. Emily screamed. The screen was full of pain, rage, and disgust. Richard and Jason sprang apart, their faces expressing shock and shame. "Emily, we can explain everything," Richard began, but the girl was already running down the stairs, tears blinding her eyes. Jason, hastily pulling on his shirt, rushed after her. He caught up with Emily at the front door, grabbing her arm. "Please, listen to me," he begged. But Emily was beside herself with fury. She broke free and pushed Jason with such force that he lost his balance and fell, hitting his head on the edge of the coffee table. There was a dull thud. Jason didn't move. Emily froze in horror, staring at the motionless body of her ex-boyfriend. A dark puddle slowly spread from under his head. "Richard," hearing the noise, came downstairs. Seeing Jason on the floor, he rushed to him, trying to find a pulse. "God, Emily, what have you done?" he whispered, raising his eyes to his daughter. His eyes were full of fear and despair. Emily couldn't utter a word. She looked at her hands, not believing that they had just possibly taken a life. Richard took out his phone to call an ambulance, but paused before dialing the number. "If we call the police, your life will be ruined," he said in a trembling voice. At that moment, Richard made a decision that determined their further fate. He put down the phone and looked at his daughter. "We have to get rid of the body. I won't let you go to jail because of our mistake." Emily, still in a state of shock, silently nodded. The next few hours passed as if in a fog. Richard wrapped Jason's body in a carpet and carried it to the garage. Then he thoroughly washed the floor, destroying all traces of what had happened. Deep into the night, father and daughter left town. They headed to a wooded area where Richard once loved to go hiking. There, in a remote ravine, they buried Jason's body. Returning home at dawn, Richard and Emily were silent. Their lives had changed forever. They had become accomplices in a crime, bound by a terrible secret. This night became the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt them for a long time to come. A week had passed since Jason Nunez's disappearance. His parents, concerned about the lack of communication with their son, contacted the police. An investigation began, which soon attracted the attention of the entire town. Detective Lisa Morgan, an experienced investigator with 15 years of experience, led the investigation. She began by questioning Jason's close ones, including his parents, friends, and, of course, Emily Carrington. Emily, prepared by her father, told the police a pre-agreed story. According to her, she had last seen Jason a week before his disappearance. He had talked about plans to go to Seattle for the weekend to visit an art exhibition. Richard confirmed this version, adding that Jason had mentioned the possibility of staying there for some time if he found an interesting job. However, Detective Morgan noticed inconsistencies in their testimonies. Emily seemed nervous and avoided eye contact. Richard, usually confident, looked tense. These small details did not escape the attentive gaze of the experienced investigator. The investigation continued. The police checked surveillance camera footage, questioned neighbors, analyzed Jason's phone calls and bank transactions. It turned out that the young man had not bought tickets to Seattle and had not withdrawn money from his account during the week before his disappearance. Jason's friends from the university said that lately he had seemed distracted and depressed. Some mentioned that Jason's relationship with Emily had become tense, although they didn't know the reasons for this. Detective Morgan decided to dig deeper. She requested data on the location of Jason's phone for the past month. The analysis showed that the young man had often been at the Carringtons' house, even when Emily was in classes at the university. This raised new questions for the investigator. Meanwhile, Richard and Emily lived in constant fear. Every doorbell, every police car on the street made their hearts stop in terror. They tried to lead a normal life, but the tension between them grew with each passing day. Emily was tormented by guilt and nightmares. She often woke up in a cold sweat, screaming Jason's name. Richard, trying to support his daughter, was himself balancing on the edge of a nervous breakdown. He started drinking to silence the voice of conscience. 3 weeks after the start of the investigation, Detective Morgan came to the Carrington house again. This time she brought a search warrant. A team of forensic experts thoroughly examined every corner of the house, paying special attention to Richard's studio and garage. During the search, traces of blood were found on a carpet in the living room, which Richard had not been able to completely remove. Forensic experts also found fibers matching Jason's clothing in the trunk of Richard's car. These pieces of evidence, combined with the contradictory testimonies of Richard and Emily, gave Detective Morgan grounds to arrest both suspects. That evening, as police officers put handcuffs on father and daughter Carrington, neighbors watched in horror from their house windows. The arrest of Richard and Emily Carrington came as a shock to the entire town. The story of a respectable architect and his student daughter, possibly involved in the disappearance of a young artist, instantly made the front pages of local newspapers and the evening news. The trial of Richard and Emily Carrington began 6 months after their arrest. During this time, the case had received wide publicity, becoming a subject of discussion not only in local but also in national media. The state prosecutor, Jonathan Hayes, presented the court with compelling evidence of the defendant's guilt. He described in detail the chronology of events, based on the results of forensic examination and witness testimonies. Hayes paid special attention to the motive for the crime. Revealing shocking details of the relationship between Richard and Jason. The defense of Richard and Emily was taken up by well-known attorney Michael Stern. He built the defense line on the fact that Jason's death was the result of an accident, and the subsequent actions of his clients were dictated by panic and a desire to protect each other. Stern tried to present Richard and Emily as victims of circumstances, not cold-blooded killers. During the trial, shocking details came to light. Emily's former classmates spoke about her hot-tempered character and tendency towards jealousy. Richard's colleagues recalled instances when he had shown inappropriate interest in young interns at his architectural firm. The most dramatic moment of the trial was Emily's testimony. She decided to testify against her father in exchange for a reduced sentence. In a trembling voice, the girl told the court about how she discovered her father and Jason together, about the ensuing argument and the tragic accident that led to Jason's death. She described how Richard convinced her to help cover up the crime, manipulating her love and fear. Richard, listening to his daughter's testimony, sat with a stone-faced expression. When it was his turn to testify, he refused to speak, invoking the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. After 3 weeks of hearings, the jury retired to deliberate. They deliberated for almost 2 days, which indicated the complexity of the case and disagreements among jury members. Finally, on the 5th day of the court session, the jury foreman announced the verdict. Richard Carrington was found guilty of manslaughter and concealment of evidence. Emily Carrington was found guilty of being an accessory to concealing a crime. Judge Martha Livingston handed down the sentence. Richard Carrington was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Emily received 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. The announcement of the sentence caused a strong reaction in the courtroom. Jason's parents, who had been present at all the sessions, cried, hugging each other. Richard, upon hearing the sentence, lowered his head, his shoulders slumped. Emily, pale and gaunt, stared straight ahead, as if not believing in the reality of what was happening. As the guards led Richard and Emily out of the courtroom, father and daughter met eyes for the last time. In that moment, a flash of understanding passed between them that their lives would never be the same again. The courtroom door closed behind them, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another, a story of redemption and, perhaps, forgiveness.